John had always dreamed of visiting the grand city known for its royal history. It was a place filled with rich culture, majestic architecture, and traditions that stretched back centuries. The buildings were elegant, the streets lined with statues of kings and queens, and the air seemed to hum with the weight of centuries of history. It was the kind of place where visitors came from all over the world to marvel at its beauty and learn about its royal past. John was no different. As he stepped off the bus and looked around, he couldn't help but feel excited about the adventure ahead. He had been planning his trip for months, and now that he was finally here, he couldn't wait to see everything. One of the highlights of his visit was the famous palace, where the royal guard stood proudly, watching over the gates and maintaining the traditions of the royal family. John had seen photos and videos of these guards online before, and he couldn't wait to see them in person. On his second day in the city, John and his friends were exploring the area around the palace. The weather was warm and sunny, and the streets were bustling with tourists just like him. The sight of the royal guards standing perfectly still in their ceremonial uniforms caught John's attention. They were unmoving, their eyes focused straight ahead, not a single muscle twitching. To John, it almost seemed like a game. The guards were so serious, so disciplined, and John found himself wondering if they ever did anything out of the ordinary, like laugh or smile. As he stood there, taking pictures with his friends, John had an idea. He knew it was a little silly, but he thought it would be funny. What if he could get a reaction out of the royal guard? After all, the guards were so serious. Surely something small, like a little prank, wouldn't hurt, right? His friends were nervous but intrigued by his idea. They warned him not to do anything too crazy, but John was determined. He figured he could do something harmless, something quick, and then they could all laugh about it later. Without overthinking it, John pulled out a bottle of water from his bag. He looked around quickly to make sure no one was paying attention, and then he tiptoed toward the guard. His heart raced, partly from excitement and partly from the anticipation of what would happen next. John, with a grin on his face, carefully poured a small amount of water onto the guard's boots. He expected the guard to stay perfectly still, unfazed by the water trickling down. But to his surprise, the guard didn't just stand there. As soon as the water hit the boots, the guard snapped to attention, his eyes narrowing. Within moments, several other guards and security officers appeared from the sides, their faces stern and serious. John's smile quickly faded. He didn't realize how serious the situation was about to become. The guards weren't amused. They had a job to do, and John's prank had crossed a line that he hadn't fully understood. In an instant, John found himself surrounded by security officers. His friends stepped back, unsure of what to do as the situation grew tense. What John thought would be a harmless joke had now turned into something much bigger. The royal guard's job was to protect the palace and maintain the dignity of the royal family. And John's actions were seen as disrespectful, no matter how small they seemed to him. The reality of the situation hit him hard, and he quickly realized that this wasn't a moment for laughter. John's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, realizing the gravity of what he had just done. The laughter he had imagined moments earlier was nowhere to be found. Instead, the atmosphere had shifted in an instant from carefree fun to one of tension and uncertainty. The security officers, with their stern faces and quick movements, began to close in on him. He could feel the weight of their gazes, and for the first time, John felt like he wasn't just another tourist in a beautiful city. He was in trouble. One of the officers, a tall man with a calm yet firm expression, stepped forward. He didn't say anything at first, only gestured for John to follow him. Without a word, John did as he was told. His friends, who had been laughing just moments ago, now stood frozen, watching helplessly. They knew something serious was happening, but they didn't know what. John's mind raced, trying to understand how a simple, silly prank had led to this. As the officers led him away from the palace gates, John couldn't help but think about what had just occurred. He had never meant for things to go this far. The idea of pouring water on the guard's boots had seemed so harmless to him. It was just a joke, something he thought would make everyone laugh, including the guard. But clearly, he had misunderstood the situation completely. This wasn't a place for jokes like that. The royal guards weren't there to entertain tourists. They were part of a long-standing tradition that represented something much bigger than any one person. John was escorted into a nearby building that looked official, though not at all like the grand palaces and monuments he had been admiring just moments before. It felt like he had stepped into a completely different world, a world where the rules were serious and consequences weren't taken lightly. The officers took his ID and asked him questions, trying to figure out what had led him to pull such a stunt. John tried to explain himself, his words stumbling over one another as he realized how foolish his actions had been. He wasn't used to being in trouble, and he wasn't prepared for what was coming. His mind was spinning. What would happen to him now? Would he be kicked out of the country? Would he be banned from returning? He had no idea how far this could go, and that made the whole situation feel even worse. John knew he had made a huge mistake, but he couldn't take back what had happened. The reality of the consequences began to sink in as the officers continued their questioning, writing down everything he said. He couldn't help but feel embarrassed and ashamed. This was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime, and now it seemed like it was turning into a nightmare. After what felt like hours, they finally let him go, but not without a warning. John was told that he would be summoned to court to answer for his actions. The seriousness of their words made his stomach drop. He hadn't expected things to escalate this far, but there was no turning back now. As he walked out of the building, he couldn't help but replay everything in his mind. What had started as a harmless prank had now become something much bigger. John had no choice but to face the consequences of his actions, and the thought of going to court filled him with dread. What would happen next? Would he be able to make things right? The next few days passed in a blur for John. After the incident with the royal guard, everything seemed to move at an overwhelming speed. He spent hours wondering what would happen next. The news had spread quickly, and he found himself constantly thinking about the court case looming over him. At first, it all felt like a bad dream, something that would eventually fade. But as the days went on, reality set in. The seriousness of his actions was beginning to dawn on him. John's friends, who had been with him when the prank occurred, reached out to him. They were shocked too, but they tried to reassure him that everything would be okay. They told him that it was just a misunderstanding, and that once he explained his side in court, the judges would see it wasn't intentional. But John wasn't so sure. Deep down, he knew that this wasn't just about a harmless joke anymore. The royal guard wasn't just anyone. They represented centuries of tradition, and what John had done was seen as a direct challenge to that tradition. It wasn't something that could just be shrugged off. The day of the court hearing arrived, and John was filled with nervous energy. His stomach was in knots as he walked to the courthouse. He had never been to court before, and the thought of being in front of a judge and possibly facing a punishment made him feel small and vulnerable. The courthouse was much bigger than he had expected, its stone walls towering over him as he entered. Inside, the air felt thick with formality. Everyone seemed to know exactly what they were doing, moving about with purpose as John tried to navigate the unfamiliar surroundings. John's lawyer, a calm and professional woman named Maria, briefed him before the hearing. She explained what would happen, step by step, and reassured him that they would argue his case carefully. "Just stay calm and tell the truth," she advised. "This is a situation where the court needs to understand your intentions." But no matter how much Maria tried to ease his nerves, John couldn't shake the feeling that this was serious. He kept replaying the moment in his mind. The look on the guard's face, the sound of the officers approaching, and the sudden realization that his prank had crossed a line he hadn't known existed. When it was time for the hearing to begin, John found himself standing in front of the judge. The room grew silent as the judge entered, a stern-looking woman with glasses perched on her nose. She took her seat and nodded for the proceedings to begin. John felt his heart race, but he tried his best to keep his composure. His lawyer spoke first, explaining that John had no malicious intent and that the incident was simply a joke that went wrong. She emphasized that John was a tourist and unfamiliar with the strict protocols surrounding the royal guard. John listened closely as she made her case, but in his heart, he knew that her words could only go so far. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was a matter of respect, and that carried weight. As the prosecutor began to speak, John's anxiety grew. The prosecutor was a sharp, confident man who wasted no time in explaining the gravity of the situation. He spoke about the importance of the royal family, the traditions of the monarchy, and the role the royal guards played in maintaining order and dignity. He argued that John's actions, no matter how harmless they seemed to him, had disrespected that order. John could feel the weight of the words, and he knew that the prosecution was building a case that would make it difficult for him to escape unscathed. It was hard to keep his thoughts straight as he waited for his turn to speak. He wanted to explain himself, to tell the court that he had never meant any harm. But with each passing minute, he felt more and more like the joke he had tried to make had turned into something he couldn't control. The court wasn't just about defending himself anymore. It was about understanding just how far-reaching even the smallest actions could be in a country with such a deep connection to its history and traditions. The courtroom felt heavy as John waited for his chance to speak. The tension in the air was thick, and John's nerves were getting the best of him. His hands were clammy, and his thoughts seemed to race faster than he could process them. He glanced over at his lawyer, Maria, who gave him a reassuring nod. Despite her calm demeanor, John could see the concern in her eyes. She was doing her best to represent him, but the case was more complicated than either of them had anticipated. John had never imagined that a simple prank could lead to a situation like this. Back home, he and his friends had pulled harmless jokes on each other all the time. But this was different. Here, in this historic city, every action felt like it carried more weight. The traditions and customs surrounding the monarchy were so deeply ingrained in the culture that even something as small as a joke could be seen as an affront. The royal guards weren't just soldiers, they were symbols of national pride and respect. John had underestimated that, and now he was paying the price. When it was finally his turn to speak, John stood up, feeling the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him. His legs felt unsteady, and his throat was dry, but he had to do this. He had to explain himself. He took a deep breath and began, his voice shaky at first. "I never meant to cause any harm," he said, his words coming out slower than he intended. "I was just having a bit of fun. I didn't understand how serious the situation was." He paused for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. The judge, who had been watching him carefully, motioned for him to continue. John cleared his throat and went on. "I didn't know the guard's role or how important it is to respect the traditions here. I wasn't thinking about that at the time. I just thought it would be a funny joke, and now I see how wrong I was." John could feel his face flush with embarrassment as he spoke. He had never been good at public speaking, and here he was, in front of a courtroom full of strangers, trying to explain himself. He felt small, almost like a child caught doing something he shouldn't. The words he had planned to say seemed to escape him, and he struggled to put his thoughts into a form that could make the judge understand his intentions. "I wasn't trying to disrespect anyone," John continued, his voice growing a little more confident. "I didn't think about the bigger picture. I just saw a guard standing still and thought it would be funny to do something unexpected. But now, I realize that what I did was wrong. I understand that the royal guard represents more than just a person standing there. It's about honor, tradition, and respect for the monarchy. I made a mistake." The courtroom was silent as John finished speaking. He sat back down, his heart still racing. He wasn't sure if his words had been enough to make a difference, but he hoped they had helped. He had done his best to explain that he hadn't meant any harm, but it was up to the judge to decide if that was enough. Maria stood up to speak next, her calm voice cutting through the tension in the room. She reiterated what John had said, emphasizing that he had acted out of ignorance, not malice. She pointed out that he was a tourist in a foreign country and had no prior knowledge of the strict protocols in place. She also reminded the court of John's clean record and good character, hoping that it might help soften the situation. But even as she spoke, John couldn't shake the feeling that the scales were tipping against him. The prosecution had made their case, and now it was up to the judge to decide his fate. As the hearing continued, John couldn't help but reflect on how quickly everything had changed. What had started as a simple visit to enjoy the sights of a beautiful city had spiraled into something far more serious. He knew now that his actions had consequences far beyond what he had imagined, and no matter how much he wished he could take it all back, there was no escaping the reality of the situation. As the court session stretched on, John's mind wandered between nervous anticipation and growing regret. The words of his lawyer, Maria, echoed in his thoughts as she continued her defense. She was doing everything she could to soften the situation, but John couldn't shake the feeling that the courtroom was a far cry from the carefree tourist experience he had imagined. He had spent days dreaming about sightseeing, taking photos, and enjoying the culture. Instead, here he was, facing a serious legal situation, all because of one impulsive decision. The judge listened intently as Maria made her arguments, speaking about John's character and his lack of knowledge regarding the traditions of the Royal Guard. The court seemed to take note of her points, and John could tell that the judge was considering his words carefully. But still, the severity of the situation hung in the air. The prosecutor's earlier arguments about the importance of the Royal Guard, the monarchy, and the respect required by citizens and visitors alike had been forceful. John knew that it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about upholding respect for the institution that had stood for centuries. While John sat there, waiting for the final verdict, his thoughts kept racing. He thought about the moment when he had poured the water on the Royal Guard's boots. At that time, he had seen it as a joke, a lighthearted prank. He had never imagined that it would lead to him standing in front of a judge, explaining himself in a foreign country. The realization that his actions had inadvertently disrespected the royal family began to sink in. John wasn't a bad person, he told himself, but he had acted without thinking and without considering the full impact of his actions. He couldn't change the past, but he could learn from it. The consequences were here, and he had to face them. The court took a short break, and John stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, frustration, and a growing sense of helplessness. He thought about his friends back home, how they would laugh when he told them this story someday. But the laughter felt far away now. This was no longer just a funny tale to tell over drinks. It was something that would affect his future, and that thought weighed heavily on him. As he walked around the courthouse, trying to clear his mind, John reflected on his life up to this point. He had always been the type of person who took things lightly, often joking around, and not taking himself too seriously. But now, standing in a foreign courtroom, he realized that some places and some people weren't meant for jokes. The traditions he had dismissed as part of the past were alive and respected, and he had failed to recognize that. When the break ended, John returned to the courtroom, his stomach still twisted with nerves. The judge re-entered the room, and everyone stood as a sign of respect. It felt like the final moment had arrived, the moment when he would finally learn the consequences of his mistake. The judge looked at him over the rim of her glasses, her expression unreadable. The room fell silent, and John felt as though all eyes were on him. What would happen next? Would he be punished severely? Would he be banned from the country? The uncertainty was almost unbearable, but he knew there was no turning back now. The judge began speaking, her voice clear and authoritative. John's heart raced as he listened closely, trying to pick up on any clues that would tell him what direction the verdict might take. It was then that he realized just how important this moment was, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever taken the royal traditions for granted. John had learned a valuable, though difficult, lesson. Now, it was up to the court to decide what would come next. The judge's words sliced through the tension in the courtroom as she spoke. John sat on the edge of his seat, barely able to breathe as he awaited her decision. The room was still, and every second felt like an eternity. The judge's voice was firm, yet calm as she addressed the court. "This case," she began, "has raised important questions about respect, both for tradition and for the institutions that hold significant cultural value. It is clear that the defendant acted without understanding the weight of his actions, but it is also clear that there was no malicious intent." John's heart skipped a beat as he listened. It wasn't over yet, but those words felt like a small glimmer of hope. He had tried to explain that his actions weren't meant to cause harm, and it seemed like the judge was considering that. The judge continued, weighing the seriousness of the situation, while acknowledging that John was a tourist, someone unfamiliar with the deep customs and rules of the country. Still, she didn't take his actions lightly. After all, what he had done was a challenge to an institution that had been respected for generations. She paused for a moment, looking at John as though she was trying to read his mind. John could feel his palms sweating, and he forced himself to remain still, even though his entire body wanted to fidget. The judge's gaze softened slightly as she addressed him directly. "It is essential for visitors to understand that while humor and lightheartedness are valued in many places, there are certain aspects of a nation's history and culture that demand respect. This particular incident, though it may have seemed insignificant to you, has wider implications." John nodded silently, his eyes locked on the judge's face. He wanted to show that he understood the weight of what she was saying. It had taken him some time to fully grasp the depth of his actions, but now, sitting there in front of the judge, he saw things clearly. He had never meant to disrespect anyone or anything, but he now understood that his misunderstanding of the situation had led to unintended consequences. The judge continued, but this time her tone softened even further. "In recognition of your honesty and the fact that you have shown remorse for your actions, the court has decided to impose a more lenient sentence. You will not be banned from this country, nor will you face jail time. However, you are to pay a fine as compensation for your disrespect to the Royal Guard, and you will be required to attend a cultural education session to better understand the traditions of this nation." John's breath released in a slow exhale, and for the first time in days, he felt a sense of relief. He hadn't been expecting the sentence to be so light. He had braced himself for something much worse, and although the fine was a heavy reminder of his mistake, he could live with it. More importantly, the cultural education session felt like a chance for him to learn something valuable, something that might help him avoid making similar mistakes in the future. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but it was a fair one, and John could sense that the judge was offering him a chance to make amends, rather than just punishing him. The courtroom began to empty as the judge finished her statement, and the officers who had been part of the process started to leave. John, still in a daze, turned to Maria, his lawyer, who gave him a small, supportive smile. She had been right all along. His remorse and honesty had worked in his favor. As they left the courtroom together, John felt a mixture of emotions. He was grateful that things hadn't turned out worse, but he knew that he would never forget this experience. It had been a wake-up call, one that had taught him a great deal about respect and the importance of understanding cultural differences. John's thoughts were still racing as he made his way out of the courthouse and into the busy streets outside. He couldn't help but think about how his life had been turned upside down by one impulsive decision. He had come to this country hoping to experience its beauty, its culture, and its history. Instead, he had found himself caught up in a legal battle, a situation he never could have predicted. But now, as the sun set behind the city's towering buildings, John had a new appreciation for the place he was visiting. The traditions of the royal family, the pride of the Royal Guard, and the significance of the culture were no longer abstract ideas to him. He had experienced firsthand the consequences of not understanding and respecting them. In the days following the court decision, John felt a weight lifted from his shoulders, but it was quickly replaced with a sense of responsibility. He had been granted a second chance, but now it was up to him to prove that he had learned from his mistake. He paid the fine, which, though a significant amount, felt like a small price compared to what could have been a far harsher punishment. But the fine was just one part of his sentence. The cultural education session was something John knew he had to take seriously, not just for the sake of his case, but for his own growth. The session was scheduled for the following week, and John decided to approach it with an open mind. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he hoped it would give him the opportunity to understand more about the country and its customs. When the day of the session finally arrived, John made his way to the location. It was a cultural center, a large building filled with exhibits about the country's history, art, and traditions. The atmosphere inside was quiet and respectful, with visitors moving from exhibit to exhibit, reading the information and reflecting on what they saw. John was welcomed by a guide, an older woman with a warm smile, who introduced herself as Mai. She explained that the session was designed to give tourists a deeper understanding of the culture, the values that shape the country, and the importance of respecting those values. Mai began with a brief overview of the nation's history, highlighting the monarchy and its role in shaping the country's identity. John listened intently as Mai spoke about the long-standing traditions of the royal family, the royal guards, and the deep respect that the people of the country had for these institutions. As Mai guided John through the exhibits, she pointed out various artifacts, paintings, and sculptures that depicted moments in the country's history. John began to feel a growing sense of admiration for the nation's heritage. He had never fully appreciated the significance of the Royal Guard, or the way that symbols of power and authority had been carefully maintained throughout the centuries. He realized that his earlier prank had been far more than just a harmless joke. It had been a violation of something that was sacred to the people here. Mai also shared stories of the Royal Guards, explaining their role not just as protectors, but as symbols of duty, honor, and loyalty. She spoke about the discipline required to serve in the Royal Guard, the long hours spent standing still in full uniform, and the respect the guards commanded from the people. John began to understand why the incident had been taken so seriously. The guards weren't just soldiers, they were living embodiments of the nation's pride and history. Disrespecting them wasn't just an affront to one person, it was a challenge to the entire tradition. As the session continued, John had moments of reflection. He thought back to the moment when he had poured water on the guard's boots. He had acted without understanding the significance of what he was doing, and now he could see how wrong he had been. The prank had been thoughtless, and in hindsight, he realized it was a poor choice. But the session also gave him a sense of peace. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about learning, growing, and respecting the culture that had made this country what it was. By the end of the session, John felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had learned so much more than he expected. May's explanations had opened his eyes to a culture he had previously overlooked. It wasn't just about following rules. It was about understanding the deep-rooted values that connected the people to their history. John left the cultural center that day with a newfound respect for the traditions of the country, and for the Royal Guard he had once thoughtlessly pranked. Walking through the streets, John felt different. He was still a tourist, still enjoying the sights and sounds of the city. But now, everything felt more meaningful. He understood that every interaction, every tradition, had a story behind it, and it was up to him to learn and respect that story. What had begun as a trip full of carefree fun had turned into an important lesson about responsibility, respect, and the value of understanding the cultures we engage with. John was determined not to forget what he had learned, and he knew that the lessons he took away from this experience would stay with him long after he left this country. As John's trip continued, he found himself reflecting on the lessons he had learned. The court case and the cultural education session had changed his perspective in ways he never imagined. What began as a simple visit to a new city, filled with excitement and curiosity, had turned into an experience that reshaped his understanding of respect and responsibility. Every time he passed by the Royal Guard, standing tall and still at their posts, he now saw them through a different lens. They were no longer just statuesque figures in uniforms. They were guardians of something much bigger than himself. The city began to feel different to him as well. As he wandered through its streets, visited museums, and explored its landmarks, He realized that every corner seemed to hold a piece of history. The culture was more than just something to admire from a distance. It was something that required understanding and respect. John had come to see how deeply interconnected the past was with the present, and how every tradition, every ceremony, and every symbol was a reflection of a collective identity that had been carefully preserved over time. John didn't just see himself as a tourist anymore. He had become a part of the story, in a way, and he was determined not to be someone who merely passed through without truly appreciating the significance of what he was experiencing. As he explored further, he made a point of asking locals about their traditions, history, and personal connections to the monarchy. His questions were no longer trivial or casual. They were genuine, as he sought to understand the depth of the culture he was visiting. People seemed willing to share their stories with him, and each conversation left him with new insights and a deeper respect for the country. Eventually, John made his way back to the royal palace area, where he had first made his mistake. This time, when he saw the guards, he stood still and observed them closely. He could hear the faint rustle of their uniforms as they moved, their disciplined steps as they paced back and forth. He watched as visitors took photos with them, carefully avoiding crossing any boundaries or making any gestures that might disrupt the guards. John realized that it wasn't just about following the rules. It was about showing a deep, respectful acknowledgement of what the guards represented. His trip, which had started with a small but careless mistake, was ending on a far more reflective note. John felt like he had grown as a person in a way he hadn't expected. He had learned that humor, while often harmless, had its limits, especially when it touched upon something that held deep cultural meaning. He had also learned that sometimes learning a lesson the hard way wasn't a bad thing. It had allowed him to see the world with new eyes and to understand that respecting others' traditions and histories wasn't just an act of kindness. It was an essential part of being a responsible traveler and a global citizen. When it was finally time to leave the country, John felt a sense of gratitude for everything he had experienced. He hadn't just seen the sights. He had learned, grown, and transformed into someone who was more aware of the impact his actions could have on the people and cultures he encountered. As he boarded his plane and looked out the window, he thought about how he would tell the story of his trip. It wouldn't just be about the places he had visited or the beautiful landmarks he had seen. It would be about the valuable lessons he had learned and the realization that every culture, no matter how different from his own, deserved respect. John's experience had come full circle. What had begun as a simple prank had turned into something much more significant, a lesson in cultural understanding that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He would never forget the importance of seeing the world not just as a collection of places to visit, but as a collection of histories, stories, and values that deserved to be treated with care and consideration. It was a lesson he would share with others, so that they, too, could understand the true meaning of respect when traveling or interacting with cultures that were not their own.